If you're like most people, you're more worried right now about money than anything else. Recent polls show that no other issue has Americans more concerned than skyrocketing prices. President Jimmy Carter has declared inflation public enemy number one, and for good reason. Food prices are soaring, prices for utilities, transportation, education, clothing, medical care, they're all climbing rapidly, and in housing, the cost of putting a roof over your head has gone through the ceiling. If you spent $100 on a big trip to the grocery store last year, you'd have to spend at least $8 more now just to buy the same goods. Last year's 60-cent bottle of orange juice now costs 82 cents because juice prices have soared more than 36% in the 12 months ending in March. During that same period, federal figures show that new car prices jumped more than 8%, an increase of more than $300 for a $4,000 car. Last year's $75 hospital room now costs an extra $8, and $1 worth of hot dogs is now $1.17. And if you're sick of it all, a $10 visit to the doctor's office will now set you back nearly $1 extra. Prices have skyrocketed on nearly everything. Wages are on the rise too, but for millions of Americans, they may not be going up fast enough to keep pace with inflation. Government figures show that the worker who made $15,000 in 1960 would have to earn nearly $35,000 this year just to stay even. Now, why is this happening to us? What's wrong with our economy?
The simplest answer to that question is that it's too much money chasing too few goods. So the ultimate source of inflation is a too rapid growth in the money supply. But there are many reasons for which this might occur.
That was David Ressler, an economist at St. Louis University. He and most other economists seem to agree that a fat money supply really is the root of the problem.
If we look at it in the context of a kind of auction where there's a fixed number of goods available or a limited number of goods available, if we put more dollars in the hands of those people bidding on those goods, the price will be bid upward.
And so you and I and millions of other consumers will continue bidding up the price of nearly everything we buy until inflation comes to a stop. Getting it stopped without causing even bigger problems in the complicated machinery of American economics isn't going to be easy, and we'll see why in our next report. While inflation is running away with your pocketbook, economists are running around trying to figure out how to stop the thief. And if they look like the Keystone Cops and sometimes working at cross purposes, it's only because the American mix of government and business has made our economic machine a very complicated thing. St. Louis University economist David Ressler says most economists do agree on the nature of the inflation problem, even if they disagree about the cause of it.
Where most economists differ over the problem of inflation is while there's a general understanding that it's too much money chasing too few goods, there's not an agreement among economists, a general consensus, as to how that too much money actually got there, whether and what the role of the government was in causing this.
Ressler says the government plays a major role in the problem. Washington University economist Hyman Minsky also points to the government. He says when an economic recession threatened to blossom into a full-fledged depression 3.5 years ago, the federal government expanded the money supply to hold that problem at bay, and that set the stage for today's problems.
That big depression that was aborted still wants to find its way out. But every time it threatens to come out, we move in with, as Mr. Ford did in 1974-5, with massive government interventions, which prevents the big depression, but sets the ground for the inflation you have now.
And it's that kind of tinkering with the economy that gets us into trouble, according to former Treasury Secretary William Simon. In Simon's words, the government doesn't have the foggiest notion as to what's going to happen when it intervenes in the economy. Simon says it's the government, not private business, that creates economic instability. Well, was price stability ever a part of the economy of America? Washington University economist Hyman Minsky says it was, and not all that long ago.
We had no inflationary problem as we now see it before the middle 60s, 1965 or so. And I think people ought to recognize and know that during the great days of American prosperity, from the days of the Civil War until the Great Depression, prices did not tend to rise, and over a long period of time, part of that period they tended to fall. the inflation as we now see it is a very new thing in the United States.
Inflation is now barreling along at a 7% rate, and some economists predict it could hit 10% or more unless the government does something about it. At those rates, the impact of inflation can be devastating. Even at a modest 4% rate, inflation cuts the buying power of a dollar in half every 18 years. At 10%, the dollar loses half its value in just 7 years. What the government is doing about inflation, and what the economists say needs to be done, in our next report. As inflation tightens its squeeze on the American economy, scores of credentialed experts from government, business, and the academic world are stepping forward with plans to stop it. Since many of these plans differ remarkably, the millions of us who are caught in inflation's iron grip can only assume that even some of the so-called experts are uncertain about how our economy really works. Washington University economist Hyman Minsky warns against any simple solutions to America's complex economic problems.
Someone told me that when you're mature, you fall in love with a woman falls in love with a man in spite of their flaws rather than because of their virtues. And our love affair with capitalism should be of that kind, that we should recognize that the inherent properties of the capitalist economy, of the free enterprise system, involve certain flaws. And only if we understand the flaws can we make it work well.
Such understanding, however, may be a rare commodity. Former Treasury Secretary William Simon says he was appalled to learn during his 3 years in Washington that most officials making important decisions about the economy didn't even know what they were doing. Simon maintains our economic system is so complex that the results from tampering with it can never be foreseen. He opposes slapping on wage and price controls in hopes of stopping inflation, and so does St. Louis University economist David Ressler.
I think that such kinds of things as wage price controls or wage price guidelines do little or nothing to eliminate the problem of inflation, unless the government does slow the rate of growth of spending. In that sense, President Carter was somewhat wrong when he said the government had little or nothing to do with inflation. The government has almost everything to do with inflation.
President Nixon imposed wage and price controls in 1971 when inflation reached 4.5%. The controls did stabilize the economy, although critics say the restrictions did nothing to solve the problems causing inflation. And soon after the controls came off, inflation soared to more than 12%. And the economy collapsed into the 1974-75 recession, the worst since the Big Depression of the 30s. Nixon Price Commission Chairman C. Jackson Grayson says wage price controls are just like aspirin. They provide momentary relief, and then the pain returns. Ressler says there is no instant solution to the inflation problem.
The way things are right now, we would be fortunate if we could get the inflation rate down into the neighborhood of 5%. And that would, in order to do that without severe increases in unemployment, is probably going to take several years of moderate restraint on the part of the government and on the part of the Federal Reserve.
Such restraint would involve cutting the huge federal budget and tightening the Federal Reserve's expansive money supply policies. And those are tall orders. We'll see why in our next report. Inflation hurts consumers in all income levels. A family of four earning $13,000 in 1970 now needs to make $22,500 just to maintain that 1970 standard of living. At the upper income level, an executive pulling down $65,000 a year in 1970 now has to make more than $118,000 annually just to stay even. The hard-working wage earner, who somehow keeps pace with inflation, still suffers a loss in buying power, and he does that by moving into a higher tax bracket. If you made $30,000 in 1970, you'd have to earn $49,650 now to keep inflation at bay. But because you'd be in a higher tax bracket, your actual purchasing power would still have dropped by 7%. Now, there is one buyer in the United States not at all thwarted by inflation. When the federal government needs more money to meet rising prices, it has ways of getting it that you and I don't have. The federal government can deficit spend, seemingly without limit, and has piled up a staggering public debt in doing just that. And of course, the federal government can expand the money supply. It can just print more money to help pay its bills. Many economists say these two government activities, reckless deficit spending and overenthusiastic expansion of the money supply, are the real root of today's economic problems, including inflation. The Federal Reserve Board has already taken action to tighten the money supply. In May, the board raised its discount rate to 7%, a half-point increase. Now, the discount rate is the interest that Federal Reserve banks charge on funds borrowed by commercial banks that are members of the Federal Reserve System. Fed Chairman G. William Miller says the move should help hold down inflation by slowing down the economy. But by slowing down the economy, the government risks throwing the country into a recession. And that's what worries Robert Strauss. He's President Carter's chief inflation fighter. He says it's easy to stop inflation. Why, we could stop inflation by next week. That's no problem. The trick is to stop inflation without bringing on a recession and without bringing on unemployment. And that is the kind of balancing act that is necessary. The problem is our mixed economy, a blend of government controls and free enterprise. It has become so complicated that some economists say even a recession may not stop inflation. Arthur Okun of the Brookings Institution says you get so little deflation from recessions now that it's like burning down your home to bake a loaf of bread. Well, if slowing down the economy won't stop inflation, what will? At the spring meeting of the Business Council, the chairman of the nation's largest corporations agreed that government spending was the biggest cause of inflation. Many economic observers, including Vermont Royster of the Wall Street Journal, say sharp trimming of the federal budget may be needed to bring the wage price spiral under control. Royster points out that deep budget cuts as a cure to inflation have been tried 3 times since World War II, in West Germany in 1948, in the United States in 1953, and in France in 1958. The cuts worked. Inflation dropped each time. But cutting the federal budget now might be a difficult chore. It means overcoming the resistance of a huge federal bureaucracy, which seems to feed on spending. And it means overcoming the objections of millions of Americans with their hands in the public trough, a description which directly or indirectly, believe it or not, includes most of us. Some experts suggest that until we learn to keep our hands out of that trough, inflation will continue to dirty the waters of American economics. In our next report, we'll look at the impact inflation has had on dozens of aspects of St. Louis life, everything from food prices to funeral costs. Inflation affects everybody. Rapidly rising prices have reduced the purchasing power of all consumers, rich and poor. But inflation does hurt some consumers more than others, and the unemployed are among the hardest hit. Missouri law limits unemployment compensation to a maximum of $85 a week for 26 weeks. Stretching those benefits to cover rising prices is difficult enough, but that's not the only inflation-caused problem facing the unemployed. Emmett Connors of the Missouri Division of Employment Security says inflation has flooded the market with job seekers.
Well, as inflation increases, of course, purchasing power decreases, and in the lower income levels, the first action taken by people is to pursue a retrenchment policy, cutting back wherever they can. However, when we reach a certain point, they will have to try to take some action to increase their income. As a consequence, a second person in the family will seek work for economic reasons to supplement the family budget.
Those extra income job seekers sometimes compete with job seekers who have no income, none except an unemployment check, and so the unemployed fight inflation on 2 fronts. Inflation makes it difficult to pay the bills, and it makes it difficult to find a job. But those aren't the only ways inflation affects the unemployed. Inflation raises the costs of doing business, forcing some firms to trim their budgets, and that can mean layoffs, putting even more unemployed into the job market. Connors says inflation also makes it more difficult for some companies and builders to obtain mortgage money, and that can depress the construction industry.
At the present time in the St. Louis area, most people associated with the industry say this has not reached the point yet that residential construction is moving ahead rather rapidly, but they do express wariness that such a situation as increased inflation occurs would have a depressing effect on the construction industry and as well on all other industries that may have had plans to expand or make capital investments.
As long as inflation exists, it will continue to hurt the unemployed and threaten the employment picture in general. And yet one of the ugly ironies in our troubled economy is that the unemployment may get even worse as the government tries to fight inflation. Economists say traditional tactics involving restrictions on expansion of the money supply will depress business activity, move the country toward recession, and lengthen the unemployment lines. Connors says that situation is dangerous.
Now, if this continues on, it can go to extreme disaster. And I pray, God, we never get to the situation of the Depression that, of course, I was a product of it. Many people now don't even know what it was, but it was fantastically terrible at that time.
The situation is terrible right now for the unemployed. Their story in our next report. Surveys show that inflation is the number one concern of most Americans. Most, but not all.
I think it's not the most important issue, not by any means. In my opinion, the most important issue of all is unemployment. Because when you're working, and even if things cost higher, you've got something. The other way, they were giving it away for half the price, if you're not working, what the devil good does it do you?
That was the voice of a St. Louis resident who is looking for a job. He asked us not to use his name. Until now, he had worked most of his life. Inflation may not be the number one issue for a person who doesn't have a job, but 35-year-old Georgia May Weaver of St. Louis says rising prices are a major problem for the unemployed.
Everything has gone up. Everything is really expensive and everything. And when you're not employed, it's just rough, just real hard on you.
20-year-old Becky Bateman of Cahokia says inflation seems worse now that she is unemployed, and it was bad enough even when she had a job.
I can't buy a house because, they're just outrageous. And with the job that I did have or the job that I will get, I won't be making enough money.
Many of the unemployed say they'd be happy just to be working again, to have a reasonable salary coming in. But that doesn't mean taking just any job that comes along. A 58-year-old St. Louis resident, who also asked us to withhold his name, said inflation has become a factor in his search for a job.
Inflation tends to put you in a position that you want to get a better job, paying job. Not so much as a job. A job is not so much as important as a better paying job to be able to swim in the current. Because today the prices are absolutely outrageous.
And those outrageous prices, rising as fast as they are, have complicated life for the unemployed. Not only is it difficult to make ends meet, not only is picking the right job becoming more important as the cost of living continues to climb, in addition to these factors, the unemployed may face a recession, a depressed economy, and who knows what else as the government tries to fight inflation. For the unemployed, the name of the game is survival.
Inflation, deflation, any kind of inflation, whatever you want to call it, whatever hand you put on it, makes no difference. We're living in a world today for survival. And nobody's getting anything on a platter, period.
Survival. Survival in the supermarket where food prices are skyrocketing in our next report.
Walking through a grocery store these days can be a shocking experience to the average consumer. Inflation has affected every aspect of our life, but nowhere has it been felt more than in the rising cost of food. The Department of Agriculture says about 21 out of every $100 is spent on food and beverages by the consumer. Experts predict that consumer food prices will rise by 8 to 10%, which means that a family of three will spend $191 more for groceries this year than last year. Each aisle in the supermarket holds another surprise for the shopper. In the past year, the price of bananas has jumped 19%, and a six-pack of cola has gone from $1.08 to $1.16. In the dairy department, margarine has increased 14%, and the price of milk has gone from 83 to 87 cents in the past year. But the biggest increase has come in the price of meat. Hamburgs have leaped from $1.15 a pound to $1.40, and the price of sausage has increased 21% in the last year. The division manager of National Tea Company, Al Cross, says the increase in meat was expected because of the cattle shortage, but not as suddenly as it occurred.
All last year, we were selling red meat at retails that were the same as they were in 1974 because the cost on the product was low, because there was an excess supply of beef on the market, for example. Now that isn't true anymore. And, you know, in my opinion, those people that grow that meat were entitled to more money for their product. They can't afford to sell their product at 1974 prices when everybody else in the whole world is making 1978 wages.
The hike in produce can be attributed to seasonal conditions and bad weather. Produce wholesaler Gary Lombardo says that lettuce reached a record high this year.
Weather is was the primary reason to drive lettuce from 40 to 50 cents a head to over $1 in many of the eastern states, and even as far as here as the Midwest. Anytime we have major growing areas like California, Texas, Florida, hit at the same time with bad weather, then of course why the supplies for the United States are just cut in half. And if it persists for like it did for a month, 2-3 months, then of course the sky's the limit for the price structure, and of course they got the highest price they ever received for a carton of lettuce in California.
Lombardo says that lettuce is on its way down in cost now. National's Cross says that when the cost of doing business includes taxes, labor, and utilities, is escalating faster than the value of the merchandise, the profits decrease. Vice President of the largest grocery chain in St. Louis, Craig Schnook, agrees.
The thing you have to remember is that ingredients are not the only cost of the product. There's many other costs that go into the product, getting it from its raw state to our stores. One of the major costs is labor. Over 1/3 of the cost of food goes directly to labor, and those costs, as you all know, have gone up. There's also been major cost increases in transportation and utility costs, and that's the reason why costs have continued to go up, in spite of the fact that some of the ingredients for certain items have come down.
Cross says supermarkets make less than 1% profit after taxes in these inflationary times. A few years ago, they used to make 1% profit. Cross says the key to fighting inflation is to increase the supermarket's productivity.
The most significant thing that we've been able to do recently are in two areas. One of them are the electronic checkout operations that are in our stores that are more accurate and more efficient than the old physical way of punching numbers into a cash register and making a collection, and that one has the opportunity to make the biggest contribution to cost control. And the second thing are the programs that we're into that we never were considering before in the way of trying to save energy and reduce our cost of operation by using less energy costs. But the rates are going up so fast that, at very best, all we can do there is hold the line.
One way to increase profits is to increase the services in the supermarkets. With more people in the working force, Cross says, the supermarkets have started carrying more non-food items so that the housewife only has to make one trip to get everything necessary to run her household. He says 50% of today's married women work and still run a household, so time is at an absolute premium. Cross says supermarkets can meet the consumer's need.
The result is that we're her dime store, her baker, her florist, her produce man, her meat man, her druggist in some cases, even in some areas now her banker, in that we accept deposits and withdrawals for some of the savings and loan companies. And what that's done is an attempt to serve the needs of today's female and male consumer that are in this time constraint of holding down two jobs in a double-income family.
Our series on inflation continues tomorrow when we look at how cafeterias and restaurants cope with the rising food costs. I'm Ann Keefe. Inflation is everywhere, at the movies, in the car wash, and most heavily at the grocery store. Yet it's not only the consumer who feels the weight of the high cost of food. Restaurant owners fare no better. Cafeteria and restaurant owner Michael Fandos of Maryland Kitchens says he doesn't like increasing prices constantly, but he has no choice.
Since January 1st, ground beef, which we use for hamburgers and stuffed peppers and things like that, has gone up from 85 cents a pound to $1.25 a pound, or 40 cents a pound increase. Well, on hamburgers, we use 4 ounces of ground beef to make our hamburgers. Well, 40 cents a pound increase means 10 cents per hamburger. The cost has gone up. We, since January 1st, have increased the price of our hamburgers a dime, and we just got the last 5-cent increase around May 15th. So we've been subsidizing hamburgers in effect.
Fandos says that restaurants and cafeterias like to shoot for a 10% profit margin, but in the past few years they haven't come close to that mark, making only 5 to 6% profit. He says the root of the problem doesn't lie with the cost of food alone. Many factors come into play.
Food prices going up is all that people particularly notice because it's the biggest item on their budget, I'm sure, other than paying for a home. But with the restaurants, not only have our food costs gone up, but our labor keeps going up. Our overhead costs, like utility bills, have increased 25, 30, 40% over the last several years. Our repairs and maintenance costs have gone up. So when we raise prices, we got to consider all the other overhead costs that have gone up in addition to the cost of food, which makes it doubly hard to increase.
Fandos says he fights a losing battle to keep up with the costs of running his business and maintaining his customers.
Every time you raise prices, you have to be running scared that people are not going to pay the price because the alternative is they bring their lunch to work or they just get by with a lot less, and we have to keep that factor in mind. And hopefully their wages are going up in proportion so that they can absorb the extra cost.
As a result of the high cost of food, Fandos has had to make some changes in the food he serves. No longer are spare ribs or pork on the menu, except as specials. And they try to fill the void with more poultry items. Menus are only changed twice a year, so that when an item takes a big jump, as meat has recently, they try to absorb the costs in the daily specials, serving items like casseroles, omelets, crepes, or enchiladas. Fandos says steaks are being taken off the menu entirely because the cost is astronomical. He charges $4.50 for an 8-ounce steak dinner. Raw meat alone costs $2.25, and there are additional costs for preparing and serving the meal, as well as the fries and the salad. But Fandos thinks the skyrocketing inflation will eventually be controlled.
I think the law of supply and demand, thank God, in the food business has some merit, and I think that what's going to happen as the price of beef goes up, some of the housewives are going to start using fish or maybe more chicken or more turkey, and all of a sudden the demand will fall just a little bit, which will control the price of beef.
We'll continue our look at inflation in our next report. I'm Ann Keefe. With food prices as unbearable as they are this year, it's a wonder anybody can afford to feed a family of 4, much less go out to dinner at a fancy restaurant. But apparently many St. Louisans still eat out often. Some local restaurant managers aren't losing customers. In fact, one claims that more people are eating out now than ever before. A manager of one of the Flaming Pit restaurants, Frank LaPiccolo, says rising food costs haven't hurt his customers' business at all, and he thinks it's cheaper to eat out sometimes, particularly when specials like All the Chicken You Can Eat are run. But the assistant manager of Reuben and Cocoa, Debbie Condon, disagrees, saying the area in which they have been hurt the most is the amount of customers. Their records show that the restaurant is down 40 people a day this year from last year. But all the managers agree that the rising food costs have brought about some changes in the way they run their business. The food manager for Stan Musial and Biggie's, Mike McCotter, says everything has gone up and it hurts.
The largest items that have sustained the largest increase, over 15% on meat, poultry, and fish. Your dairy products are up over 6%. Fruits and vegetables so far are up over 7% increase. And farm products have not reflected this increase yet because we really haven't received the fresh-grown produce yet. But I understand that it's going to be quite high by the end of August and the beginning of September.
McCotter says they increase prices on their menus about 2 or 3 times a year, but he says it's usually a futile effort.
It seems like no sooner than you do print your new menus with your new prices that something else is going up, so therefore you have to average this out. There are some items that will offset the higher items, such as in seafoods, will offset the meat increase if seafood doesn't go up. But that's not been the case. Seafood and your farm products and your meat are going up at all times.
McConnor says that when prices are increased, it can be anywhere from a nickel to 50 cents. He says seafood costs are astronomical, but many times you can't pass the cost on to the customers because you price yourself right out of the market. Most managers avoid removing an item from the menu because customers get upset when they find a favorite meal has been taken off. President of the Pasta House Company, John Ferrara, says they don't put some items on the menu since they're too costly.
There are things like that that we would like to have on our menu that we don't because for that reason. I'd love to sell lobster, but we can't do it because it's just we don't want to have an entree on our menu that we have to get $14 for. Or shrimp, I would say, is like that. We do sell tenderloin, but we don't make a. We're lucky if we break even on it, but we have it there again as a service to the customer.
Ferrara says some items are an absolute necessity, but it's almost impossible to keep up with the food price increases.
We use a tremendous amount of tomato products, tomato paste, and whole tomatoes. And the price, I guess, over the last 6 months has gone up about 20% on those items also. Well, for instance, I remember when we first went into business 10 years ago, we were paying about $6.75 a case for tomato paste. And last year we got a buy on tomato paste. We bought 2,000 cases because we got it at $18.50 a case.
We'll continue our series on the effects of the inflation on the economy in our next report. I'm Ann Keefe.
Between 1972 and 1976, the price of a new single-family home increased almost twice as fast as incomes and prices in general. During that time, the median price of a new home went from $27,600 nationwide to $48,800  5 years later. Those figures are part of a 106-page federal task force study which found that since 1972, housing prices rose higher than family incomes for the first time, effectively pricing countless families out of the housing market. Savings and Loan Association spokesman Robert Drolich says the inflated housing market takes its toll on young families who have not previously owned a home.
As housing costs increase, the amount of money necessary for a down payment goes up, and the payments will increase with the size of the loan. Houses today are increasing anywhere from 6 to 15% a year. As the price of homes go up, the monthly payment becomes more, the interest rates are higher, and many young families either do not have the initial down payment, or if they have the down payment, their income isn't such that they can afford the monthly house payments.
Home Builders Association President Dick McBride says that housing costs began skyrocketing in 1974 during the Mideast oil embargo.
At that particular time, anything that was made with chemicals, concrete, cement, tiles, carpeting, and everything, boy, they just skyrocketed. So they have really taken a jump since that time, and they're continuously going up. Lumber last year went up, I wrote that, 35%. 35% in 1 year. Concrete went up 28%.
And ground, too, is more expensive as the cost of lots in St. Louis County has doubled since 1970. McBride says government regulations also increase housing costs.
County government, not only in St. Louis but all across the country, they strive to have more things installed in that particular subdivision. Sidewalks on both sides of the street, so much street lighting that you can't even sleep at night, and so all of these things just increase the cost.
The result of inflation is that the average new home in St. Louis costs between $45,000 and $47,000. And that, says Drolich, isn't bad if you compare St. Louis with other housing markets.
If you compare to St. Louis to Los Angeles or Denver or Boston, San Francisco, Houston, Dallas, are in many instances twice as high. In Los Angeles, sometimes 3 times as high as a home in St. Louis. A house in St. Louis that would sell for $40,000 in many of these other cities would be $70,000 and $80,000.
The problem is the $40,000 home is getting harder to find, and the $20,000 or $30,000 price tag, that's becoming a thing of the past.
The $20,000 or $30,000 home has disappeared from the market unless it is a home which is built several years ago and is being resold and has been resold several times. When one looks at the cost of labor, the cost of materials, the cost of land, it's almost impossible to buy a home for $25,000 or $30,000. Today, mobile homes are selling for that kind of money.
Not only are the prices of homes escalating, the cost of borrowing money to purchase a home is also on the rise. We'll look at that in our next report on inflation, the American nightmare. One of the chief ironies of today's inflated housing market is that as the cost of homes increases, so does the cost of money. The reason is that money, like the homes it purchases, responds to the law of supply and demand. Spokesman for the Savings and Loan Association, Robert Drolich, says there's less money available for mortgages.
The demand for loans increases, and there has been an increasing demand. In addition to that, the federal government is looking to finance its expenditures and goes into the open market and issues treasury bills or requests for federal funds. That money, which would normally go into the private sector, into the housing market, some of that money is being siphoned off by the federal government. And as they take money out of the private sector, well, there becomes less and less money available for the housing market.
The tight money market means many things to the family seeking to purchase a home.
It could mean higher interest rates because money is a commodity whose price is determined by supply and demand. It would mean that where a family may want to get a loan in which they would only put down 10%, may now be required to put down 15 or 20% down payment so that there will be more money to go around for more people. It may also mean that you cannot get a loan because some financial institutions may very well reach the point where they are limiting the number of loans they can make.
Interest rates in the St. Louis area have increased about 1 full percent in the past year, rising from 8.5% to 9.5%, or in some cases 9 3/4. Now, when you're dealing with home mortgages, fractions of a percent can translate into thousands of dollars. For example, on a $50,000 home carrying an 80% mortgage, a hike in interest rates from 9% to 9.4% means nearly $2,500 more to the prospective home buyer. That amount is reached by adding up the monthly payments for 20 years. At 9%, the total comes to $86,376. At 9.4%, expenditures reach $88,860. Is there an end in sight? In Missouri, law prohibits interest rates of more than 10%. And that, says Drolich, means that some lending institutions will become more choosy about to whom they lend money, and some people may not qualify for loans. But he adds the savings and loans in the metropolitan area have established a fund to avoid a money-lending crisis. In the meantime, says Drolich, the demand for homes is still high because the purchase of a house, many believe, is a hedge against the very same inflation that's driving the cost of that home upward.
Many people who have put off buying a home because they feel that the costs are high, that the financing charge is high, the home itself is high, that have now come to the conclusion that unless they buy now, they're going to be paying more 3, 6 months, and a year from now. And so the purchase of a home today is still a good buy in today's money market and with today's inflation.
One effect of that inflation, say the realtors, is that people are taking a second look at older homes. But what they see there is a similarly inflated market as with new homes. We'll look at pre-owned homes in our next report as inflation, the American nightmare, continues. A St. Louis County man advertised his home in the Sunday paper. When he returned from church services that day, 5 prospective buyers were at his front door. two offered more than he was asking. That story is indicative of the demand for older homes in the metropolitan area. Inflation has made its mark, too. The combination of the two, the law of supply and demand, and an inflated dollar, has driven the cost of old homes up to an average price of $52,000 in the St. Louis area. William Dolan of Dolan Realtors says a house in the 5600 block of Walsh in southwest St. Louis that sold for $21,000 in 1972 was resold in 1978 for $46,000. A house off McKnight Road in West St. Louis County sold for $70,000 in 1973 and for $110,000 in 1977. Dolan says even though homes are costing more, the public is still buying.
People have made up their mind to buy simply because they think that inflation is going to continue, and therefore they say, well, we'll buy now.
Older homes, he says, are more affordable for many people than building a new house during an inflationary period.
People, particularly young people, they can get more bedrooms and more bathrooms, more living for their families.
Prices, he predicts, will keep rising, especially in some areas of the county.
Residential real estate in Clayton is probably, I'll use the word, the hottest, because of its location. There is I don't know how many lots are available to build in Clayton, but the government centers there, the office buildings where businessmen are, the school situation, transportation, churches, all of that sort of thing.
Realtors admit that there's a major problem with inflation's impact on older homes. Insurance is costly. Given inflation's effect on building costs and materials, the price of replacing a home with 12-inch walls, high ceilings, and hardwood floors is also on the rise. So home buyers are advised to make sure that they can purchase insurance before they buy. We'll continue our look at inflation in our next report.